One of the great perennial debates that historians like to have among themselves concerns what are the forces that really drive historical events and that really determine the course of history. Marxist historians, on the one hand, claim to find economic motivations and struggles over resources at the root of all historical causation. Environmental historians point to broad patterns of climate and characteristics of topography to explain why some civilizations flourished while others withered away. Some historians like to maintain that huge, impersonal, long-term forces determine everything, and that human beings and their civilizations just ride atop these forces like flotsam on a wave. Currently, a group of historians asserts that technology is the key factor that explains why things have happened, and others use biological metaphors or natural cycles of growth and decay to try and unearth meaning and find structure in the historical record. I suppose the number of different possible approaches is probably as myriad as the number of historians themselves. One explanation for historical causation that is no longer trendy, but that enjoyed considerable popularity for a long time, is called the great man theory of history. Today, I suppose we would call it the great person theory of history. But the basic idea is that every so often, individuals come along whose actions are so significant that they create a major moment of historical change and they set the course of history off in a totally new direction. Now, there are a lot of problems with this theory, but if you were try and argue in support of it, the individuals that form the subject of the next 4 lectures might well provide you with some of the most compelling evidence. These lectures are going to look at 5 rulers who, it could be argued, changed the course of history. The first 2 are a father-son team from the Mediterranean. The next is an Indian king and his grandson. And the last one is a Chinese emperor. And as I describe each of their careers and accomplishments over the next 4 lectures, keep in mind the great person theory of history and ask yourself this question: would things have turned out in a similar manner if this person had never been born? Or by his choices and actions, did he truly alter the broader course of history itself? All right, we'll begin with the Macedonian father-son team of Philip II and Alexander the Great. After the trauma of the long 30-year Peloponnesian War, pretty much all the Greek world was exhausted. This war had been extremely destructive, both in terms of the human and the financial costs. Sparta was the nominal victor, and Sparta attempted to take over Athens' leadership role. But this really doesn't work well. The national character of the Spartans and their tendency towards isolationism really makes them ill-suited to run an empire. And so the attempt at a Spartan empire soon collapsed. The next half-century in Greece was a politically confused time of constantly shifting alliances as different states struggled to make themselves the dominant power. But no one is particularly successful or long-lasting or influential. And so we'll simply skip quickly over this era and instead shift our attention to a nearby region where dynamic events are underway that will ultimately transform not only the immediate Greek world, but everywhere, all the way from Egypt to India. Just north of Greece was the Kingdom of Macedonia, sometimes called Macedon. Macedon was at the time a backwards country, just composed of rural farmers and goat and sheep herders. There are no major cities, really just a bunch of tough rural rustics. The country is notionally ruled by a king, together with a group of nobles. But the king's control over the nobles is very weak, so that power is decentralized and the state itself really doesn't amount to much. In the year 358 BC, a new king came to the throne in Macedon, and he sets in motion steps which, within 30 years, will cause the entire known world, as they knew it, to fall under the control of these sheep herders from the northern fringes of civilization. His name is Philip II, and he will be one of the most dynamic and creative rulers in history. Now, he's probably not as famous as he really should be, because his achievements have somewhat been eclipsed and lost in the shadow of those of his son, Alexander the Great. Philip inherited a small, weak, poor, and disunited state. He quickly sprang into action to change each one of those factors. And the methods he used provide almost a textbook for how you can transform a country in the ancient world and build it up into a powerful state. The very first problems that he addressed was the internal instability and weak centralized authority in Macedon. So he starts by rebuilding the capital city, Pella, and he turns it from a small village into a first-class modern city. Philip was an ardent admirer of Greek culture, and so he refashioned Pella on the model of a Greek city. He went down to Greece and he brought Greek architects and artists up to Macedon, and he had them build the various structures, such as temples and theaters, that you would expect to find in a city like Athens. He also brought Greek philosophers up to Macedon, and he established them at a kind of educational institution at which young Macedonians could learn about Greek culture. Philip sent his own children to this school, but he also invited all the noblemen of Macedon to send their sons there for free in order to take advantage of this opportunity. And they could also then be attached to the court and benefit from sort of the best education available. The reconstruction of Pella served an important symbolic purpose. It gave Macedon a central political and cultural focal point, and so this alone helped unite the country and give it more of a sense of identity. The school he set up, on the other hand, at first glance just looks like Philip being a nice guy. But here we see, for the first time, his trademark craftiness. Now, one of the big problems for Macedonian rulers in the past had been that tendency of local lords to revolt against the king. But think about what's happening now. Philip effectively has in his hands at Pella all the sons of the lords because they're there attending the school. So, under the pretext of benevolently providing an educational service, Philip has, in essence, secured voluntary hostages who will guarantee the loyalty and the good behavior of their fathers. Not only does this eliminate rebellions in the short term, but it also ensured the unity of the country for the next generation. And this is because Philip's own son, the future king of Macedon, attended this school. So growing up, his childhood friends and companions were the future lords of Macedon. So when that whole generation grew up together, the king would be united with his aristocracy by these long-standing bonds of friendship, which went back to their childhoods. And this is exactly how things work out. And Alexander and his boyhood friends even refer to themselves as the companions. And together, they'll eventually form an elite cavalry unit in the Macedonian army. Philip was also a master of using marriages for political effect. So he would arrange marriages between various distant relatives of his and key rulers or noblemen that he wanted to tie to himself in order, again, to strengthen his position, maintain peace, or gain the loyalty of someone. With this problem of unifying Macedon solved, the next area Philip had to tackle was resources. He needed lots and lots of money, both to pay for Pella and to reform the Macedonian army. His solution to this problem was very straightforward. He simply took advantage of the weakness and the political confusion in Greece in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War to simply steal some especially rich silver mines, which were located nearby in the territory of a Greek city called Amphipolis. And these were the very same mines, by the way, that had played such an important role during the Peloponnesian War. The seizing of the mines of Amphipolis amounted to outright theft. But Philip calculated correctly that the Greeks were too weak and disorganized to oppose this move. With the wealth that came in from these mines, he now had the resources for the third part of his program, transforming the Macedonian army into a new and highly effective fighting machine. We've already seen the hoplite military revolution, and now these actions of Philip really constitute another key military revolution. So to begin with, he adopts the basic Greek phalanx, but he adds a twist to it. Instead of carrying spears that were about 6 to 8 feet long, like a Greek hoplite, Philip's phalanx is armed with an extra long 12 to 15 foot spear called the sarissa. The Macedonian sarissa-equipped phalanx now has a reach advantage over their enemy. The downside to these long spears, and the reason why everybody doesn't just use longer spears, is that they're very awkward to handle. They require intensive training and careful coordination among the troops to avoid confusion. So Philip solves this by making his Macedonian army a professional one. In other words, instead of being composed of militia who are just called up to fight only in times of war, like most Greek states, Philip's army, like the Spartans, trains year-round for war. The second aspect of Philip's military reforms was to make this new Macedonian military a mixed army. And this means that it was composed of different types of troops, each one equipped with different weapons and having their own tactics. So the core of the force was the heavy sarissa-bearing phalanx. But Philip also now has lightly armed skirmishers, archers, slingers, heavy cavalry, all sorts of different types of troops. And in the past, the Greeks had mostly fought one another by simply lining up two phalanxes and smashing them together. Now, that kind of warfare doesn't require much in the way of generalship. All you have to do is say, march forward, and that's about all the generals do. But with the mixed army of Philip, it puts a premium on good generalship, and it can reward creative tactical ability. This is because, for example, now a general could say, I'm going to send one part of my army to do one thing in battle while another section does something else. And so there's a potential latent in the new Macedonian army that had not been present in those earlier, simpler Greek armies. All of these changes and reforms took several decades, and they actually happened in a somewhat more overlapping manner than I've described. But the net effect was to transform Macedonia from a weak, obscure state into one with great promise. And Philip immediately puts his new army to use, and one by one begins to conquer his neighbors, the other small kingdoms of the area. Once again, though, he does this in a clever way. He uses marriage alliances and diplomatic treaties to make peace with all other states except his intended victim. And once that state is isolated, he would conquer it. Then he would switch focus to another kingdom, isolate it through marriages and alliances, and then knock it off. And so using this divide and conquer strategy, Philip one by one subjugated all the surrounding areas. Having built Macedon into a regional power, Philip now began to eye targets which were further afield. And of these, the obvious big one is Greece. But once again, he goes about it in a crafty manner. He befriended some Greek states so as to keep the Greeks from uniting against him. And he even managed to get himself a seat on a council, which previously was composed only of Greeks. Now, there were some Greeks who saw right through Philip's schemes, but many of the Greek states were too absorbed in their rivalries with one another to form any sort of effective united front against him. And finally, in 338 BC, Philip and his new Macedonian army roll down into Greece. And a little bit late, in desperation, a coalition of Greek states finally banded together to try and stop him. And the key battle for the fate of Greece took place at a site called Chaeronea. And at Chaeronea, the new military system of Philip proved superior, and Greece too now fell into his grasp. It's really possible to view 338 BC and the Battle of Chaeronea as the endpoint of Greek independence in the ancient world, because from that moment onward, even though occasionally they'll claim autonomy, the Greek city-states almost always are under the control of some more powerful empire. As for Philip, in just 20 years, he's built his obscure nation into the leading power in the Eastern Mediterranean. But the Greek world is still just a tiny, unimportant corner of the broader world. And the most powerful nation was still Persia. The Persian Empire remained a gigantic and wealthy superpower, which stretched from Egypt to Afghanistan. Encouraged by his successes, Philip now began to formulate his most daring plan yet. He thought maybe it might be possible to invade the westernmost fringe of the Persian Empire, and maybe even wrest some of it away from Persian control. And this was really an audacious idea. The Greeks had famously turned back the Persian invasions, but it was another thing entirely to contemplate taking the offensive against Persia. But nevertheless, Philip started to plan an expedition to attack Persia's westernmost colonies. Philip was obviously a very smart and creative ruler, but over the last couple decades, he had paid a physical price for all this success. 20 years of constant fighting had left their mark on his body. Among other things, one leg had been shattered, and this had left him with a leg that was shorter than the other one. One of his eyes had been gouged out by an arrow, and so he had to wear an eye patch there. In 336, while he was organizing his great expedition, Philip was attending yet another wedding, being held to cement some alliance, when suddenly he was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. Now, the killer was immediately killed by the other guards, and so it was never clear who had hired him to murder Philip. But a lot of suspicion fell on one of his wives, named Olympias, who had recently been replaced in the king's favor by a younger woman. The heir apparent to the throne was Olympias's son, Alexander, who at this time was just 20 years old. And to be Alexander's personal tutor, Philip had hired no less a figure than Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher. And he had brought Aristotle up to Macedon, to Pella, to personally supervise the boy's education. And Aristotle had been very successful in inculcating into the young Alexander an intense love for Greek culture. Indeed, one story tells us that Alexander supposedly revered Homer so much that he slept every night with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow. Later on, when Alexander captures a very precious box, he decides that his most valuable possession that he could keep in this box was his copy of Homer's Iliad with annotations by his teacher Aristotle. In addition to this love of Greek culture, Alexander also got a thorough military education. So even by the age of 18, he was already in command of a section of his father's army at the Battle of Chaeronea. Now, at this point, it's probably worthwhile making a couple comments about the personality of Alexander. He appears to have been one of those extremely charismatic individuals who come along every now and then, who's able to arouse intense adulation and loyalty from the people around him. Now, it didn't hurt that he was supposedly extremely physically attractive. All the women fell in love with Alexander, and all the men fell in love with Alexander. And it does seem pretty certain that he had both male and female lovers. His trademark physical feature was this kind of exuberant, puffed-up head of hair that swept back dramatically from his face in this very distinctive, high, bouffant sort of hairdo. And Alexander enjoyed having a good time with his friends, partying with them, particularly the companions, and so he would spend many nights engaged in raucous bouts of drinking. So young, athletic, beautiful, smart, and charismatic, Alexander was a true boy wonder. However great his talents, no one, though, expected that he would have to exercise them quite so soon. But Philip's assassination thrust him into the spotlight before many of his advisors really thought he was ready. After his father's death, Alexander faced many of the same problems that had confronted Philip on his own accession. There were a variety of external enemies threatening Macedon. His own position as king was insecure. There were two other rival candidates for the throne, though both of those were still children. And the news of Philip's death had been greeted with great joy among the states that had been conquered by Philip, including the Greek city-states, many of which revolted. Athens and Thebes both revolted immediately against Alexander. At this critical moment, Alexander acts decisively and boldly. His strongest support comes from the Macedonian army, who immediately acclaimed him as king. And this very well-armed and disciplined force created by Philip was probably the most valuable aspect of Alexander's inheritance. The danger of internal dissension for the throne was quickly eliminated by the effective, if just a bit brutal, method of having his two rivals put to death. And those external threats were dealt with just as decisively. Alexander's army marched immediately down into Greece with such swiftness that they arrived before any resistance could be organized. And so Macedonian domination over Greece was reestablished. He then quickly marched up to the north and in a lightning campaign reasserted control over all of Macedon's neighbors. So, in a single year, Alexander had firmly secured his position as king of Macedon and leader of Greece. But he wasn't content with that. And so now, picking up where his father had left off, he turned his attention to that expedition against Persia. And in the spring of 334 BC, he crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor at the head of his army. And it's estimated that he had about 40,000 infantry and maybe 5,000 cavalry. His very first stop was at Troy, where he visited the grave of his particular hero, Achilles, from Homer's Iliad. Alexander clearly identified with Achilles and even claimed descent from him. And this whole veneration and identification with Achilles was all part of Alexander's admiration of Greek culture. So to honor Achilles, Alexander and some of his companions stripped naked and ran races around the tomb of his hero. Meanwhile, though, the satraps of Asia Minor had been gathering up their local troops to oppose Alexander, and the two armies met at the river Granicus. The Battle of the Granicus was the first of Alexander's 4 great battles in Asia. And in defiance of standard military strategy, Alexander somehow managed to successfully charge across the river and up a slippery embankment and then defeat the Persians. And in true Homeric fashion, like his hero Achilles, Alexander personally led the charge, and he suffered a couple minor injuries, including one blow that split his helmet. And Alexander only avoided death due to the timely intervention of one of the companions. In keeping with the whole great man theory of history, it's interesting to speculate how history itself might have been different if Alexander had met a premature end on the banks of the Granicus River. Nevertheless, that victory left Alexander in control of Asia Minor, and he then marched along the coast, capturing various cities until he reached Cilicia at the extreme northeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea. Well, at this point in his career, Alexander had fulfilled his father's dream of invading Persia and wresting away not only the contested Ionian states, but even some of the westernmost territories of the Persian Empire proper. And this was an amazing achievement. It was something that deeply impressed the Greeks as well as everybody else. And there was a general expectation at this point that Alexander would return to Greece and rule over what would now be the largest Greek empire yet seen. But this was not what Alexander did. Instead, he turns his army eastward and continues his march, heading towards the core of the Persian Empire in Mesopotamia. And so this suggests that, certainly by this point, his ambitions had outgrown his father's, and Alexander is contemplating even more grandiose schemes of conquest and glory. Well, this kind of challenge could not go unanswered, and sure enough, the Persian King of Kings, Darius III at this point, now decides he will march out and confront Alexander personally. And in the next lecture, we'll see what happens when those two meet. Before we follow Alexander on his great campaign to the east, though, I want to pause and reflect for a moment on Philip's accomplishments, and to go back to those questions of historical causation that I began the lecture with. So think about it. Was it inevitable that Macedon, of all places, would rise to power at this time? Or was Philip solely responsible for that happening? If Macedon hadn't been transformed into a powerful state, would some other state have stepped forward and fulfilled the same role? In the broader scheme of things, did the rise of Macedon really make a difference? And finally, a question to keep in mind throughout the next lecture. Without Philip to lay the groundwork and the foundation, would Alexander have been able to accomplish what he did? Thank you.